It is so great to see you. Well, sort of see you. I have a brand new microphone, so it does not require hands. It clicks directly into my laptop. And so you get to see like all of my hand movements in their right natural state. So this week, by the way, I kind of wanted to let you know, folks, you did a fantastic job on the exams. And I know that right now you're going through, like, we're all going through a really rough time, but I really want to thank you for doing your best on that exam. And I want you all to know how proud I am of you. And I am very lucky to have students that are like you. And I just wanted to let you know that. Also, here's Earl. Hi, Earl. Okay, so today we're going to talk about group processes and we're going to talk about work teams. And I'm going to tell you the truth. Some of this, if you had me or if you've had Dr. Cole for social psych or that one semester where I taught it, some of this might seem a little bit familiar. But I'm going to tell you the truth. It's hard for me to talk about group processes and work teams, and here's why. I hate group work. Even when I was in college, when I was in high school, when I was in middle school, I absolutely flat out hated group work. So some people really love group work. Some people like me really hate it. I especially hated it when I felt like my grade was kind of on the line, based on other people's performance. And I have an independent streak a mile wide, and I'm like, you don't get to determine my grade. I'm a control freak. I'm the only one who does. Generally, I tend to find that the people who like it really enjoy the collaborative atmosphere that, group work can really take. It helps develop a sense of camaraderie and things like that. I know that last year's group of research methods students, for example, put together an impromptu informal study group. I think it helped them develop a sense of camaraderie and kind of an idea of cooperating and working together and really feeling like they were in a cohort. I don't know why I made this a question, but it can be incredibly hard to allocate work fairly in a group. I've certainly seen this in cases where I've had students do group projects. You can never really tell when a group is going to slack off or when a group is going to improve. Now, as it turns out, a lot of these behaviors that we see are functions of both the person as well as the environment itself. So we're going to spend some time talking about some of the different environmental variables that come into play that lead to things like slacking off on group work or facilitating group work. So why do we emphasize group work so much? I try not to do it as much as I can, I think because I hated it so much. But generally, group work can be beneficial. In the workplace, you're going to have to work with other people. You're going to have to collaborate with other people. And, you know, that's even true for my job where I actually have quite a bit of independence. Yes, I develop my own lectures. Yes, I develop my own tests, but I collaborate with other faculty members in a department. So group work is useful. It's a very common way for students to learn about the material, develop better interpersonal skills, conflict resolution, collaborative efforts, and achieve things that might be a little bit more difficult to achieve on one's own. And even if you're in a class like mine where I don't really do group work, you are probably the member of a group of some kind working towards some kind of collective goal. So this week's focus is basically what are the different social dynamics of groups and how does this affect teams at work? Now, one of the reasons that I'm really kind of bummed about kind of this remote teaching thing, this is normally the time where I would give you something called the Stranded on the Moon task, where I have a bunch of different things in kind of a list of different types of equipment that you might need if you were on a NASA mission that got stuck on the moon, and everybody would have to try to figure out which items were most important and were least important. So unfortunately, we don't really get to do that, but I'd like you, as you listen to this lecture, to kind of reflect on some different times that you've had to collaborate with other groups or work with other people, and kind of think about what worked for you and what didn't, and see if you can make connections between those experiences that you've had and the kind of things that we're going to be talking about here. So here's what we're going to be talking about. We are going to talk about the difference between a work group and a work team. Hey, here's a spoiler. They're not really all that different. We'll talk about some of the different social influences in groups. We'll talk about group decision making. And then probably next week, we will talk a bit about modern conceptions of work teams and current trends. So we're going to start by talking about work groups versus work teams. So what is a work group? A work group is an interdependent collection of individuals. So when we mean interdependent, that means that there is some degree of independence, but at the same time, all of these individuals are relying on each other and are to some extent dependent and responsible for each other with respect to reaching specific outcomes for the organization. So a work group is basically a group that has this interdependence at a workplace. Now, here's what's really critical. These people have to actually work together. If they don't work together, they're not a group. So, for example, people sitting together on a bus does not qualify as a group. But if the bus doors get stuck and they have to work together to basically get those doors open, then they're a group. So the idea that really separates a group from a not group is that you're all working together for a common goal, whatever that goal is. So we can make a distinction between a formal group and an informal group. A formal group has been officially established by the organization. So for example, I'm on different committees. Those are formal groups. Now, on the other hand, the study session, the study group that my research method students formed would be a perfect example of an informal group. This was something that was developed by the students outside of the structure of the class itself. Now, informal groups are really important. Now, we're largely going to focus on formal ones, but informal groups will also have their benefits. Generally, they're going to help us satisfy our social needs. You don't tend to find informal groups that don't really like each other. If you have an informal group that is made up of people that really don't like each other, I'd like to study that group, because that you don't normally see that kind of thing. Generally, these people like each other, so you're satisfying a social need. They satisfy security needs. They provide a feeling of safety and a sense of connectedness. They facilitate additional cooperation among employees, and they also delegate and regulate different types of social behaviors or different types of task behaviors that basically create group norms, possibly even disseminating organizational norms and procedures. So if a new person comes in and is a part of this informal group, the other members of that group can explain how things kind of work in the organization in a way that they can understand. Now, let's kind of move on to talk about work teams. So I've already kind of talked about work group. What's the difference between that and a work team? So previously, very early on in industrial and organizational psych research, work teams were considered a group of individuals that had true interdependence. They have to work together. In contrast, work groups do not necessarily have to work together. So this is what was previously believed. These days, we do tend to use work group and work team interchangeably, and both of those terms do imply some amount of interdependence. So now let's kind of move on and talk about some of the different social influences in groups. So one of the big things that groups help do, especially within the workplace, is they help establish and educate other workers about workplace norms. So a norm, when you hear the word norm, you should think about the word should. Norms in the workplace are shared expectations. Oh, hi, Fluffy. Norms, he is breaking an important norm. Don't interrupt the lecture. Norms are basically shared expectations of appropriate ways of responding in a group. So, for example, let's think about some norms that are starting to become pretty common in this weird era that we're in. So obviously kind of covering your cough, wearing a mask if you're going to be in places where there are going to be a lot of people, maintaining 6 feet of distance, not spending time with people that aren't in your household. All of these are starting to become social norms to the point where people are starting to kind of police each other on how well they're following those norms. Now, norms can help serve an important function. They can tell us about what behaviors are off limits. They can tell us about what behaviors are really inappropriate. Washing your hands, I think, is going to become a norm that should absolutely be enforced. I thought it was. Apparently not. Apparently we needed more reminders to wash our hands. So norms are important. They help us figure out how to function in society. Don't stand too close to each other. Things like that. Norms typically come in 2 different varieties. So we have what are called descriptive norms, and then we have what are known as prescriptive norms. Typically, a descriptive norm defines what most people do, feel, or think in a situation. Prescriptive norms define what we should do, feel, or think in a situation. And so these don't really sound all that different from each other until you think about how we tend to view people that violate both types of these norms. So violators of descriptive norms are viewed as unusual or different. So for example, it's kind of a norm. Most people make eye contact. Most people have voices that are within a reasonable volume. So if you violate descriptive norms, if you don't make eye contact with people, or if you tend to speak either in a very loud voice or in a very quiet voice that nobody hears, worst case scenario, you're going to be viewed as unusual or different. So descriptive norms, when we talk about how most people are, anybody that violates that is going to be a little bit different. If you violate a prescriptive norm, especially in the workplace, you are going to be viewed as dysfunctional. If you believe that deadlines do not matter and that you shouldn't necessarily treat your coworkers with respect, or that some of the different rules that are in place at work are merely suggestions rather than imperatives, you are not going to be viewed as unusual or different. You are going to be viewed as dysfunctional and a detriment to your workplace. So how do we determine these different types of norms? Now, some work groups will make a list, but most of the time, these develop gradually over time. So these norms do not necessarily have to be very, very specific to the workplace. So for example, I can think of groups that formed in various workplaces that I was in that didn't really have a sense of norms at first. They would be welcoming to pretty much anybody, all comers and things like that. And then over time, as certain members of the group became more cohesive and there was more of a core group of people, you would start to see those norms develop. So for example, some norms I've seen in groups have been things like, don't have positive things to say about the organization, which is probably why I was not allowed to be in some of those groups for a while, because I tend to not do well with a lot of negativity in the environment. So these norms will develop gradually. And generally, this is going to happen, as I kind of said, when group members tend to become more comfortable with their place in the organization, and especially when they become more comfortable with each other. Norms are often going to be passed down by employees. So kind of think about how, as kind of a cute example, think about how the different rules here at Cody about things you're allowed to do as a freshman versus what you're not allowed to do. How did you learn about those in the first place? odds are pretty good they were handed down to you by somebody else in the college. So generally what we're going to find is that new employees, they're not really going to be like, if they think that the rules or the norms suck, they're not necessarily going to try to change them. New employees will often adapt or adjust. And part of the reason that they're going to be a little bit less likely to change them is because oftentimes we will find that interpersonal conflict can absolutely result when a newer employee acts against a prescriptive norm. So for example, let's say that you're in a workplace that really values itself on not taking sick days, even if you don't feel well. I have a feeling in the current environment that is something that will probably change, but I know that this is pretty common. If you're not feeling well, some people just push through. They don't take a sick day. And what we will tend to find is that newer employees who aren't aware of those norms or want to try to challenge those norms and actually take a sick day when they're sick, you may get some conflict. You may get some unfavorable responses, people not really liking that. And generally what we will find is that counterproductive work behaviors can result. Oftentimes what we will find is that if there are one of the things we find is that group norms can either enhance counterproductive work behaviors or they can interact and basically reduce those counterproductive work behaviors. So if you see somebody doing something that is detrimental to the organization, you can step in and go, hey, are you familiar with our rules? Maybe we should have a talk. And I've seen this happen a couple of times as well. So let's talk about workplace roles. So when you're in a group or in work, you have a certain role. Now your job behavior, we're going to talk about this more. This comes from Kurt Levine, who is very well known in social psychology. He's also very well known in IO psychology. But there's this idea that your behavior is a function of the person that you are and the situation or environment you find yourself in. And we're going to keep coming back to this idea. So your job behavior is a function of who you are and the situation that you're in. So how does your role factor into all of this? So we have to kind of distinguish between a couple of different terminologies here. So the first is a role concept. How do people perceive the different situational forces that act on them? So for example, if you're a student, your role is basically comprised of what you think a student should do, the role concept, and what you should do as a student. Now, what you think a student should do and what you should do as a student are probably a little bit different, but both of those kind of work together to form a role concept. So a role itself is a set of behaviors that is expected of a person who occupies a certain position in a group or an organization. And this is going to be affected by your personality traits as well as larger environmental expectations. So if you think about your group of friends probably play different types of roles within the group. I've kind of discovered I'm a little bit of the mom friend. These days I check in on my friends, maybe text them once every couple of days. I'm like, hey, how's it going? Because I'm the only extrovert in my friend group, I've also basically been the person that has to organize things, because if I don't do it, nobody else will. And you can probably think about what kind of role you occupy in your friend group. And that's partially based on the personality traits you have. I am probably the mom friend because I'm incredibly conscientious and also incredibly prone to worry. But there are some environmental expectations as well. A friend checks in on their other friends, and that's what I think a friend should be, and that influences my behavior. This not only holds for informal groups like friend groups, but this is also true within the workplace. Now, generally, one of the things that you have to help people with is the concept of role differentiation. Oftentimes, people need to have a sense of what their role is in the group, what they bring to the table. And one way to kind of do this is with role differentiation. We basically determine a distinct role for a group or for members of an organization. And this can be accomplished in a few different ways. It can be accomplished through formal job descriptions. So my role is differentiated as a psychology professor. If I see an English professor trying to teach a psychology class, I'm going to get a little miffed. And that's because we have this role differentiation. This is also accomplished by rules and task requirements, as well as by supervisors, subordinates, and coworkers. And they will communicate expectations and beliefs regarding the role that you have. So right now, for example, we have been expected to deliver maybe not the same quality of what we would be doing if we were in person, but we have been expected to continue to do our jobs and also kind of check in on you and make sure that you're doing okay. That has been expressed to us, and for right now, that is my role. So we'll kind of stop here and we'll talk some more about what goes on in work groups and work teams next time.